Welcome everyone to Parent Chat. I'm so glad you're here for this extremely important programming. We are bringing in an expert in the field to talk about suicide prevention and how you can make a difference in your household. Let me just introduce Megan very quickly before we bring her on screen. She is the school-based programs manager for Forefront, which is based out of UW. It's a comprehensive suicide program geared towards the K through 12 age group. And it's really about, it comes from a passion of empowering communities and families, parents, schools, any type of community and organization to really effectively deal with mental health challenges. And when we talk about suicide, it can be a very scary topic, and many parents don't want to bring it up to their kids for fear that it will instill a thought of suicide. And Megan's going to walk us through that, and we're going to talk more about that. But I would highly recommend and encourage all of you to share this after tonight, after you are able to listen to this and learn from Megan. Share it with people that you know, because as we need to let as many parents know as possible how to prevent and how to talk about suicide effectively. So I would love to welcome Megan, you on screen, and have you take it from here.
Let me just share my screen really quick.
Sure.
All right. Can everyone see the right slide?
We can see it. It looks great, Megan. And I just want to also let everybody know that if you want to ask questions, we highly encourage that, but put it in the Q&A box so it doesn't get lost. And you can find that near the bottom of your screen. Meanwhile, any comments as we go, you are welcome to put those in the chat box. We'll be monitoring that, but all questions should go in the Q&A box. All right, Megan, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you so much. And good evening. A special thank you to Sherry and the Balance in Minds team for inviting us to partner with Parent Chat. I'm really thrilled to be here this evening. So as was already said, my name is Megan Rybel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the school-based programs manager here at Forefront Suicide Prevention. So we are a center of excellence at the University of Washington, and our mission is to help people take action to prevent suicide in their community, whether that's your home, your school, or the organization you work with. My programs interact with K-12 education at the state, region, district, and school level, supporting schools in comprehensive suicide prevention, intervention, and response. So I come to all of you tonight with over 15 years experience as an educator, coach, school counselor, and I'm also a mom of three. Mom who has had to ask one of my own children about suicide. I do this work because I deeply believe that we all play an important role in helping to prevent suicide, and that you being here today could potentially save a life. The QR code on the screen right now will provide supporting documents to guide you through our conversation and link to additional resources. Once I slow down in my talking, I'll also try to drop that in the chat. And please you're welcome to engage as much or as little as you'd like. I thrive off of audience feedback, and webinars are hard. So use the chat, ask the Q&A, use reactions if those are activated. I don't think they are. Just know I may hold some questions until the end of the evening, so we have time to cover everything I'm going to share with you tonight. And no, Sherry already said this, but this content can be challenging for a variety of reasons. Be kind to yourself now, during, and after this training. Something we can all do starting today is help shift the negative perceptions and stigma around mental illness and suicide. We can do this simply by changing our language. I invite you to say died by suicide or took their own life, and invite you to think about why this change might be important. You're welcome to share those ideas in the chat as you're listening. But really, it's about, we want to stay factual and neutral. The word committed associates suicide with being a crime or a sin. It can be hurtful to those who have lost loved ones to suicide to use the word committed. And the word committed can sound both positive or negative. You can either commit a crime, right? Or sometimes you're super committed to a relationship or an exercise routine. So again, it's about taking away judgment, about using neutral language, supportive language. And we recognize that the shift might take time, but if we start doing it today and together, we can remove judgment from our language so that we may lessen stigma around suicide and mental health. We also know that there are lots of myths about suicide and so many things we do not yet know. So let's start with some of the things we do know. There are lots of myths about suicide. Oh, where is that? Suicide affects all communities. People of any background can be at risk for suicide, no matter their identity. It is true that some groups are at a higher risk for suicide. This includes veterans, LGBTQIA+ communities, Alaskan Native and American Indians. It can also be like white men in their middle years, right? The most at-risk population of all. And we know that suicide can impact up to 115 people, and up to 25 of those immediate impacts can also experience a major disruption from a loss in their life. I want to remind us today that asking about suicide does not cause suicide. It is very common to be concerned that asking about suicide plants an idea in someone else's head. However, we know that asking about suicide doesn't cause suicide, and in fact, you can actually lower the amount of distress that someone is experiencing by asking. It's also important to remember that suicide results from multiple complex factors. We often tend to focus on stories where there's just one cause, but we know that it's really a complicated and complex system and result of many things interacting all at once. Suicide is a complex topic, and each day we learn more about what makes someone at risk and what protects them. One of the things that protects folks is happening right now. You are here taking time out of your day to learn about suicide and to support someone you care about or love. We know that there are things that protect our kids, and these are the things that give me hope. We protect our kids through connections to friends and family, culture and community. We protect them by limiting access to lethal methods like firearms or medication. We protect them by providing them the opportunity to build coping and problem-solving skills. And we protect them by making sure they have access to physical and mental health care, which we know is sometimes challenging in the current state of behavioral health and workforce. I don't want to spend too long on statistics, but I think it's important for those of you who might be new to this topic to understand the gravitas of this problem and challenge. These are national and local statistics that represent the larger data about youth in Washington, but also the country. There was a 36% increase in high school students who seriously considered attempting suicide in the decade between 2009 and 2019. According to the Washington State Health and Youth Survey, which our youth take every other year in Washington, of our 8th, 10th, and 12th graders surveyed in 2021, approximately 1 in 5 Washington State students reported considering suicide in the last year. Up to 15% of our youth reported making a plan to end their life, and up to 9% of our teenagers made a suicide attempt. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among our young people, ages 10 to 24. Understanding the needs of our youth allows us to better identify support and advocate for the right level of behavioral health support and care. It also allows us to step in when and where we can. Why do teens consider suicide? People who attempt suicide say it's not always about wanting to die. It's about wanting to end an unbearable pain. These thoughts can cause deep psychological and emotional pain and lead people to conclude that the way to end that pain is to die. So what is our role as a parent, caregiver, or another concerned adult? We can collectively learn how to recognize common warning signs. We can know how to respond when someone may be considering suicide, and we can understand where to get help. This information can and should be used for anyone in crisis, young or old, big or small. And please remember that when you are supporting someone you care about through suicidal ideation or crisis, you are not responsible for the final act. And if someone dies by suicide, you are not responsible for someone taking their own life. I'm going to ask you all a question, and you're welcome to respond in any way. You can even just raise your hand in your bedroom, or your living room, or your car, wherever you're meeting us from. But raise your hand if you've ever been trained in CPR. I have, many. What's the goal of CPR? Yeah, thanks for that thumbs up. Someone out there has been trained. Good for you. Well, just like CPR, learning how you can help may actually save someone's life. And your goal is to help a person get through an immediate crisis, and then you would let the professionals take over to continue care. That's some of what we're going to talk about in our model tonight. At Forefront, we use LEARN as an acronym to help us remember these potentially life-saving skills. L stands for look for signs. E stands for empathize and listen. A stands for ask about suicide. R stands for reduce the danger, and N stands for next steps. We'll start with the L step, which stands for look for signs. We know that many people who are considering suicide will show some warning signs. Warning signs are clues or signals that someone could be at risk for suicide. And one way to think about warning signs is to think about them in these three buckets or categories: emotions and feelings, actions and behaviors, experiences. Many people already have some idea of what they should keep an eye out for. I'd love to hear from you. What do you think are some of the common warning signs for suicide? Withdrawal. Thanks, Sherry. Definitely one of them. Giving away possessions. Thanks, Tiffany. For sure. As you continue not wanting to hang out with friends, I love this. Keep them coming, and I'll keep talking at the same time. So yeah, when we notice emotions, right, that withdrawal or that sadness, maybe that self-isolation, there's feelings that go with it. It's mostly behavior. That's one way to recognize the warning signs of suicide. One thing that I think is important to note is sometimes we remember someone who's died by suicide experiencing a sudden or unexplainable joy after a period of deep depression. And I think it's important to recognize that change in emotion might be stemming from relief and knowing that pain that they're experiencing will soon be ending because they have a plan to die. The relief can also be mistaken for a sign that their depression has lifted. I also see a number of actions and behaviors, right? Remember that behavior is a function of need. Pay attention. Valerie says, like, remember that mom or parent or caregiver spidey sense that something is off. We often know our kids best. And when there are changes in their typical behavior, it's a good idea to pay attention. They might not be considering suicide, but something's probably up. And finally, sometimes our experiences become warning signs or risk factors for suicide. That could involve a recent loss or a family history of suicide or suicide ideation. It can be a significant life change or transition. It can be discrimination linked to sexual orientation, gender identity, race, or ethnicity, including personal or historical trauma. But it all comes back to, like, what does it actually look like in our kiddos? It can be easy, I think, to misjudge the depth of the pain our children can be in. And every young person is different. You might see a kid, teen, youth who is stressing over a significant loss, who they stops wanting to do the things they used to enjoy, is increasingly overwhelmed by everyday stressors, who escalates their risk-taking behavior. This could include using drugs or alcohol, engaging in high-speed driving, or other activities that put life at risk. Maybe they're talking or posting about hurting themselves or wanting to die. This could look like talking or joking, which is super hard in this generation because it seems like everyone is always talking or joking about death. At my house, it always means you get checked in with. Saying that they feel like they're a burden to others and it would be better off if they were gone. When a young person starts saying goodbye to friends or family members, including on social media. So remember, recognizing that a change from a young person's regular patterns and behaviors is crucial to noticing their behavioral health. When you see multiple changes in behavior, it's time to learn more. So let's talk about empathy and listening. Empathy and listening play an incredibly huge role in suicide prevention and in maintaining healthy relationships. So let's think about this. Let's go through a quick practice scenario. Imagine that your child tells you that they're struggling. Which of these is the best example for demonstrating empathy? 1, you could offer solutions to fix the problem. After all, you don't want to see them hurting. You could share a story about a time that something similar happened to you. You might sit beside them and say, wow, it sounds like you're going through a lot right now. Or 4, you could pull up a funny video on your phone to help cheer them up. Oh, someone's already sharing. Yes, number 3, for sure. One of the things I often tell folks is that if you're not sure how to respond, think about a time when you were having a painful experience and you needed to be seen and validated. Or you can ask the person you're sitting alongside of what might be most helpful to them. No worries, Valerie. Sometimes that number 4, pulling up a funny video on your phone to cheer them up, is exactly what you need, but it is not necessarily an example of empathy. So let's talk a little bit more we know about empathy. So even if we know what it is, it can sometimes be hard to demonstrate it in the moment. I think especially as a parent or a caregiver. Here are 4 components of empathy from Teresa Wiseman that are helpful for me to remember. We see the world as others see it. So really looking at it from someone else's point of view. To be non-judgmental. To validate others' feelings, even if you don't agree. And to communicate that understanding back to them. It's so important for us as adults in the lives of young people to remember that we don't need to agree with someone's feelings or to even fully understand why they feel the way they do, but we do need to understand how they feel and to be able to share that back to them. People who've survived suicide attempts say that listening is what they needed the most. So here are a few examples of how to respond with empathy. You might say, I'm so glad you told me. Tell me more. I'm listening. You must be really hurting. It's okay to be honest. I'm here to help. I love you no matter what. These are some things that may or may not work for you. Think about what feels authentic for you in your own words, right? Angela, you're welcome. Sometimes it's helpful to have a statement in your back pocket. Just remember those statements should be something that feels right for you. It shouldn't feel like Megan is talking. It should feel like Angela is talking. If you want to know more, we can share some resources at the end of the video, but I have 2 examples of Brene Brown video and my all-time favorite example, which comes from the movie Inside Out, when joy and sadness are comforting Bing Bong over the loss of the red rainbow rocket. It is a beautiful and visceral example of what empathy can be. So once you share empathy, you're going to ask about suicide. And this is hard, so we're going to talk through it. It's easier as you practice. So when your child is struggling or having a tough time, it often means that you will likely have to have hard conversations about difficult topics, including, but not just, suicide, right? And we build ourselves up for these conversations. We panic about these conversations. Sometimes we find them in unexpected places after we've had the worst day ever. So when we have the opportunity to prepare ahead of time, these are some things you can do to prepare yourself emotionally and mentally, right? Think about where you're going to have that conversation. Practice the learn steps ahead of time. Make sure you have resources available and think about your own support system. How are you going to put that oxygen mask on first before you help someone else? But you can also think about, how can I practice in advance? So even if I had to have this conversation on the fly, I could do it and I would be prepared. Trainings like this, practice like this, help us build the muscle memory of how to respond when risk is present. It is scary, and it is so much better to ask and be terrified while asking than to leave it go unasked and to lose someone. So when you ask, we're going to do something really courageous and really direct. Remember, asking about suicide does not make it more likely that a person will consider suicide. And the best advice is to be both courageous and direct. Many people will be honest if you can ask them in a direct and compassionate way. It can also relieve people's pain and distress. Avoid vague language or judgmental statements. Here are two examples of how to ask. Are you thinking about suicide? Are you thinking about killing yourself? If we can't say the words, neither can they. When we ask directly about suicide, we are demonstrating that we are open and willing to have a direct and conversation to discuss a really complicated and scary topic. We ask and invite that person to be honest. We're showing them that we see them and that we care about them, and what happens to them. We also give them an opportunity to share their burden and not feel alone. If you feel like these words are too difficult to say, you could also ask, are you thinking of ending your own life? Or are you thinking of ending your life on purpose? The important thing is to be direct and to avoid judgment. I want to acknowledge that this step can be incredibly difficult for both the person asking the question and the person answering. So, how do we ask about suicide? I'm going to give you, just like those empathy statements, a little formula or prompt to use when you're in a conversation with someone you're worried. So you would say something like, sometimes when people are, insert your warning signs here, isolating from friends, upset after a breakup, have had a significant change in their normal behavior, feeling hopeless about the future, they're thinking about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? So here's so I gave you that example. Asking like this is helpful because saying people and they helps to normalize their experiences and thoughts. It includes the warning signs that you have observed, and it shows that you're really listening and paying attention to what they're going through. And while suicide is less common in younger children, it does occur. So when you're thinking about asking a younger kiddo about suicide, those questions that I mentioned right on the last slide, have you ever wanted to die on purpose? Or have you ever wished that you never had to wake up anymore, that you could be dead? So how do I ask? And when do I ask, right? You ask when you see multiple signs, when you see big changes in a person's life or behavior, or simply when your gut is telling you that something isn't right. Trust that spidey sense. Most teens, even those with multiple risk factors, will never attempt suicide. But many grieving parents thought their children were simply going through a phase, or after an attempt or death, then realized that their child was warning signs, was showing lights. So again, there is never harm in asking about suicide. And if you're concerned, even if what you're seeing isn't clear or lined up like it is here, just ask. And I see a question in the chat around elementary risk assessment in the first half of this school year. And we can talk more about that as we keep going. I really think from my experience, both as a parent and as a school counselor and at Forefront, the way you ask and the way you talk about this is almost exactly the same for the little ones as it is for the big kids. The little ones know what it is. And they are also in that place, right, of wanting to end a pain that they don't understand, can't cope with, or can't grasp. Right? It's not necessarily about wanting to die. It's about this big thing that they don't have the skills to cope with. So when you ask, what should you do if they say no? Stay neutral and non-judgmental. Keep a neutral expression, body language. Avoid looking relieved or even saying, oh my gosh, I'm so glad, right? Let them know that you care. Even if not thinking about suicide, if they're not thinking about suicide in this moment, they're having a tough time, and tough enough time that you thought to ask, right? Letting them know that you care gives a clear message that it's okay to talk about suicide. If you're still concerned, right? They've said no, your spidey sense says otherwise. It's okay to gather more information and to ask again. Maybe they need a little bit more empathy or some validation before they're ready to share what they're thinking. If you still get a no and you're still concerned, you might consider asking, if you were thinking about suicide, who would you talk to? This is a great question because it gives the person the opportunity to think about other supportive people in their life. And you might also share some of the resources that we'll give you later in this training. So lastly, we're going to move on to the R and N steps, which can help reduce dangers in someone's life and make sure they have the support that they need, right? You can't ask and not be ready to take action. So if they say yes, stay neutral and non-judgmental. Please take it seriously. Make sure that you thank them for their honesty and sharing something difficult. I can't begin to count the number of students I have thanked through my career for sharing the pain that they are in with me. Acknowledge and validate that pain. It's real, even if you don't understand it. And then be willing to move on to the R and N steps. And when you're done with that conversation, whoever it's with, take care of yourself. You might need to debrief with someone you trust, or even with a resource listed later on in this training. Here's the question to think about as you mull this over, because sometimes a student or a young person or even our own kiddo will say yes, but then ask you not to tell anyone. Think about how you might respond and what you might do. So there's lots of things that we can do to reduce the danger in our lives. This step is about taking practical action to help keep someone safe. It means that we are reducing or removing, depending on your role, access to things that someone could use. So you've asked about suicide and you've heard a yes. These are crucial and critical follow-up conversation questions that you need to ask. You need this information and this clarity. So asking, even if it's hard, have you thought about how you might end your life? Do you have access to those methods? And have you thought about when you might do this? Asking these follow-up questions will help you to understand the level of risk this person might be posing, right? They might have no plan versus a lethal method at home that they could use tonight. But if you don't ask, you don't know. It helps you gather necessary information that you can pass on to a doctor, to another parent if your kiddo or a friend of your kiddo is disclosing to you how they feel. It helps you determine whether emergency services are needed in the moment. Through all of these questions, it's really important to continue to show compassion and care, even if what you're hearing is difficult or scary. And what I think is so important and powerful is that putting time and distance between a suicidal person and the methods they may use can actually save a life. So as we talk about ways to reduce the danger, keep these statistics in mind. 56% of our team say it's easy to get prescription drugs, or I'd say even over-the-counter drugs, from their parents' medicine cabinet. 95% of us parents don't believe that our children would ever take a prescription drug for misuse. 90% of suicide attempts with a gun are fatal. 82% of youth suicides by a firearm involve a family gun. Suicide is 3 times more likely in a home with a gun. We have an important role to play. So talk with your children about the dangers of misusing alcohol, drugs, medicine, and model safe storage in your own home. If I didn't have my Buddha background on right now, you would see that my bedroom closet next door to me is open. And in that closet is the lockbox we keep all of our families over-the-counter and prescription medication in. So let's talk about how we keep our home safe. It's almost like toddler proofing or baby proofing your home, but it's doing that for suicide risk, right? We know that many suicides and suicide attempts can be prevented. People at risk for suicide can sometimes act impulsively, and that can be especially true for young people without a fully developed frontal lobe, right? Many people thinking about suicide will choose one plan and method. If we need to ask them what it is, because if their chosen plan and method is prevented, they often don't substitute another. So this is how you can keep your home safe. Today, you can secure your firearms and medication in a lockbox or a home safe. This top section, right, includes items that we should all lock up all the time. And then this bottom purple square is what we should lock up in a crisis. Additional items that you might consider while someone in your home is in crisis or seriously. We don't expect to get into a car accident every time we drive, but we wear our seatbelts whenever we go on a road trip or just to the grocery store, just in case there's an accident. It is the same thing with locking up lethal means. We don't always know when someone will be suicidal, so locking up lethal means can help keep people alive. Take a minute to think about the spaces in your own home and what you could do today to lock or limit access. I see that question in the chat, and we'll get to it. I'll talk about that next. So let's talk about the final step in the end model, and then we'll move on to some questions and comments. So the end step is all about connecting the person in crisis to resources that can help. And my mouse is not going. Here we go. So during the crisis, don't expect the person to get help on their own, and don't leave them alone. Seek help immediately. If there is immediate danger, call 988. This can include support staff with lived experience. Responders can do a welfare check if you are unable to reach a person in crisis. And we recommend making whatever decision that you think is right in the moment to keep that person safe. You're going to connect them to a counselor or a crisis line, and you might start with the crisis line, right? Because it's more available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Ask trusted people to help remove any dangers. And following the crisis, right? You're going to continue to check in and offer support. You're going to make sure that you contacted your care team. That could be a pediatrician, a relative, elders. You might speak with your school and or supportive community organizations about how they can support your kiddo. And foster a culture of help seeking within your family. Make it okay to not be okay. Encourage asking for help. Practice coping skills. Strengthen your family and community support to include behavioral health services. Here are some really helpful resources in a crisis. 988 launched this summer. We're thrilled about it. They can connect you 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with trained crisis counselors to discuss suicide, mental health, and substance use crisis, and any other emotional distress. You can call, text, or chat 988. You can text the crisis text line in English or in Spanish. The Trans Lifeline and the Trevor Project are great resources for trans and non-binary youth and LGBTQ youth. The National Suicide Prevention Line can support veterans simply by pressing #1. And I agree, Sherry, if anyone in your community has a phone, these numbers should be there and easy to remember. Just like we all had the yellow cab in our phones way when before Uber was a thing, have these numbers in your phone. Know that they're there. Also, it's always okay to test out any of these crisis lines just to practice. Non-emergency calls are always welcome. It could even be to talk about, oh man, I want to talk about that friend of my kid who just shared this thing with me and I'm not sure what to do with it. I want to talk about the spidey sense I have as a mom, dad, caregiver. That's all okay. Or maybe you just had a really big conversation with your kid and you need to talk it out yourself because you're feeling stressed. Use that support. I'm hoping that all of you can take a picture of this slide, because if we were in a Zoom room together, it would actually make us practice, because I think this is the most important part of the skills that Forefront teaches, is how to actually use a scenario to practice the learned steps, including saying the word suicide out loud, asking about suicide, asking about legal needs, and talking about next steps. So after tonight's talk, please find a partner in real life. It could be a friend, a co-parent, a partner, a work colleague, stranger on the bus if you're super brave, and take turns practicing the steps in both the parent and child role. Work through each learned step. And for the sake of your practice, say yes during the A step. When you do this at home, don't just discuss the scenario. Really step into the roles in practice. The more you practice asking, are you thinking about suicide? The more confident you will be if and when you need to use that phrase with someone you care about. So these are action steps you can take today. Add the 24-hour crisis resources into your phone, your kid's phone, your grandma's phone, everyone's phone. Lock up and secure medications and firearms in your home. I saw someone in the chat say, oh man, I need to lock up those over-the-counter medicines, right? And check in with your child daily. Listen with empathy. Find the moment in your day where you have that quiet, right? Just for a second. Let them see you seeing them, right? It could be bedtime. It could be driving someone to practice. It could be as you walk a kiddo to the bus stop. Maybe you walk the dog together with a different child each night of the week. Whatever it is, find a routine that allows you to build in those check-ins. And then seek out support. Connect with your school counseling staff, with the crisis line, and create and model a culture of health and well-being in your home. I want to stop there because it's a lot. And I want to take the time to answer questions and to uh, get the Q&A. And I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually see all of the Zoom features while I'm doing it.
Excellent.
So I did see a question in the chat, and it says, let's say a friend of my child has this conversation with me, right? Not their own parent. What do I do after? And do I let them go home? How do I talk to their parents? And I think this is a really important next step, right? That kiddo is opening up to you because there is a relationship and a sense of care there, right? So you have to honor that. They are talking to you because you are a safe human for them, right? And so then you talk to them about, man, this is so hard to hold. I am so glad you told me, and this is not something I can keep to myself. My job as an adult in your community who cares about you is to keep you safe. Who are the other adults that we can bring to this conversation? How can we do that together, right? Give that kid some choice. Do they want to call their parents or caregivers with you? Do they want you to call ahead of time and say, hey, this is the conversation I just had with Jimmy? Give them choice. And be that warm handout. That's part of the next steps, right? And if I was talking to educators right now, especially teachers, coaches, I would say to them, like, your student in your class is talking to you because that relationship is there. They might want to have anything to do with the counselor, right? We're the people that have no grades, diplomas, report cards, but nothing good comes with it, right? Or maybe that's what the child thinks. And so if the teacher or educator is able to say, hey, school counselor, I just had this conversation with so-and-so. This is what we talked about. I asked about suicide. They said, yeah. This is the plan they have to end their life. I am bringing them to you because you are the person in our school building that is responsible, tasked with keeping kids safe. And I need your help because I can't do this alone. Kiddo, did I get everything right? Is there something you need to add to this conversation, right? Same thing. It is a really hard thing to pick up the phone and call someone else's parent, whether you are the school counselor or a friend of a friend of a friend, right? And it's also an honor and a privilege to know that that young person trusted you with how they're actually and authentically feeling. So you have to pass that on, right? So take care of that kid and do the same thing that you would want another parent to do for you. Like, pretty sure you wouldn't want someone to hold that, right? So that's what I would do. Get as much information, make a plan with the kid, and then make that.
Megan, in that question, just to follow up a little bit, they also said, do you let them go home? And so that, let's say that you aren't able to reach their parents or reach anybody else. Do you say basically you need to stay here until we find your parents, or
I think it
something like that?
really depends on how they answer those follow-up questions, right? If they are just generally thinking about suicide, but they have no defined plan, they have no sense of timing, they haven't even thought about methods. They're in that place of like, I just feel really crappy with life right now. And that's really different than being in imminent danger. And so I think that anytime you don't have a good sense of the level of risk, right? We're not asking parents to be trained psychologists or to do risk assessments with folks. One step you could do is call the crisis line together, right? Call 988 and get some more information. Get that kiddo on the phone with someone else and then ask their opinion. Can I send this kid from my room right now? Do I need to wait for their parent? Do we need to go to the ER instead? What's the best next step? Because lots of times someone can be suicidal and can be seen 10 days right after by a therapist to follow up. Sometimes they need to be seen, right? And that is a hard thing to. And so I think if you are unsure, hold on to that kid for as long as you feel like you need to, until you can pass them off in a way that makes you feel safe and confident, but is also supportive to the kid, right? Don't hold them hostage if they're just having a good time.
Another thing I wanted to follow up on is when you're talking about what do you do when they say don't tell anybody? And what I really loved about your response there was that you didn't go into fix it mode. You weren't saying, oh, I'm going to deal with this. Hold on, let me call everybody. You empowered the person in that moment. And when they're already feeling helpless, it's so important to ask the questions and to let them be in a position of making choices. So I really liked the way that you phrased those questions.
Yeah, and I see in the chat someone just following up on that, right? When you aren't sure of level of risk, involve someone else, involve an expert. And that's what 988 is there for. It is there to help us assess whether a crisis is a crisis and what the next step should be. And we should use it.
Right. Okay, let's see. Another question. What if your child tells you that their friend is considering suicide, or you know they are supporting someone who is talking about suicide? This is a really good question because I work with a lot of teens who are playing therapist to their friends. And so, yes, I'd love to hear your answer to this.
Oh my gosh, I think it's so hard, right? Especially when we think about the teenager who is developmentally like, I can do everything and I am invincible and I am totally ready to live my own life and do it in my own way, under my own terms. And there's just this intense sense of loyalty that young people feel for their friends, right? I don't want to rat this person out or to be the reason they got in trouble or whatever. And I think what is hard is that we have to remind ourselves that it's not our job. It's not their job to hold that for someone else, right? That's the reason we have helpers in our community, right? I wouldn't walk into my living room and ask my husband to help me fix a broken leg. He's not a doctor. He can't help me with that. The same thing is true about suicide. Let's ask for help from the folks who actually know how to do the helping. The right kind of support is so critical in having a well-supported, well-functioning, skillful life, right? And I think we want to give our kids the permission to not be responsible for their friends or the life and death situations regarding your friends, right? It's like, yes, you can listen to them, you can empathize, you can validate. And when this is about safety, we have to share, right? We have to keep talking, right? And I think that is exactly, give them permission not to be responsible. Now I'm like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I said that. It's like, wait, it's an Esther. So that means I said it. But I also think maybe it's an opportunity to do some learning with your kid, right? Let's call the crisis line together and talk this through. I see you holding on a lot, holding on to a lot, and it's impacting you. You're not sleeping. You're worried about this other person all the time. You won't leave your phone behind because you're worried if they text you, you won't be there to answer. That is a big burden. Let's talk about how we can care for you, right? Put your oxygen mask on first so you're able to help that other person with the support and care that they need.
One of the things that I hear from people is from teens is they don't want to tell because they might lose their friendship. And I remind them, wouldn't you rather lose the friendship than have that person lose their life? And they'll, when they think of it like that, yes, I'm willing to lose the friendship so that they can get the help they need.
Yeah, and I think it can be a really good reminder, but we have to be careful as adults to not make that sound trite, right?
Hmm.
Like you'd rather
Yeah.
have a bad friend than a dead friend. Don't say that.
Hmm. Yeah.
But I think it is really important to think about, like, let's imagine that they're not here tomorrow.
Yeah.
Like, how would you feel, right? And I'm seeing a lot of chats now about folks who are supporting their young people after the loss of someone that they cared about. Um, and that's really hard, right? We go back to those statistics about what we know, right? Having a suicide in our circle is an increased risk factor for us. And grief after suicide is hard. Um, it's confusing and complicated and different than another kind of death, and also the same. It's messy. And I think being able, right, to remind our young people, like, we can't know everything all the time. And even though we can see warning signs now in hindsight, right, we might not have been fully attuned to them then. And it's not our fault to miss it. But it's a time or place where maybe you can think about how you would want to reach out to a friend in the future if you saw similar things, right? To pay that forward. And it's hard. It's so hard.
Megan, one last question. We're about out of time. Um, Another thing that comes up quite often is that people will tell their friends, if you don't do this, especially in like romantic relationships, if you break up with me or if you don't do this with me, I'm going to kill myself. So, how should those kids respond when they are hearing those messages?
I I feel like that's another place, right? So that's when all of a sudden the threat of suicide becomes coercive.
Hmm.
And that is like a whole nother ball of wax, because then we're talking about unhealthy relationships, potentially abusive or toxic relationships. And it's really, really scary to be the receiver of that ultimatum, right? So I think honoring how scary that place is for that kid, and recognizing our job is to take care of you in this situation and offer this other person avenues for support. But it is not your job ever to keep someone else, right? It's not your responsibility. Another great scenario to say, hey, let's text the crisis text line. Let's call 988 together. Maybe that is a parent to parent communication of, hey, um, I am noticing this friendship. I mean, I try as much as possible not to like meddle in the friendships of my children, but that's a place where I would get involved, right? Either
Hmm.
directly with that parent or with the school to say, hey, this is what I'm hearing from my kid, and it's not okay. And I want to make sure that this kiddo is supported. But right now, my job is to play mama bear for my kiddo and protect
Thank you. Great answer. Okay, so we're wrapping up now. If anybody has questions that you think of later tonight or at a different time, just let us know and we will do our best to get those answers to you. Megan has kindly shared her email address there so that we can you can contact her directly if you have questions and need further resources. But you'll also be receiving a follow-up email with a lot of the resources and information that we talked about tonight. So if you didn't take really good notes, don't worry, the information is coming your way. Megan, thank you so much for coming tonight. Any last parting words for us?
I just wanted to share that like I'm happy to PDF the slide deck, make a little neat packet for you. So as you
Excellent.
send this off to families and participants, they have something to help them.
Wonderful. So as you leave, I would ask that you put in the comments something, that you learned tonight, something that stuck with you, something that you will do differently perhaps, and even let us know if you are going to have this talk with your teen or your younger kids or kids' friends, whoever, let us know if you're going to be doing that so we can all kind of encourage each other as
And
well.
it's okay to have a really large medication lockbox. Like just buy yourself one on Amazon. It's fine.
That's great. Yes. Yes. A good recommendation for sure. So I'd also like to invite everybody to join us for our next parent chat, which is on April 19th. And this one is my kid's personality is different than mine. How do I connect with them and support them? And this with Jessica Butts, who is a psychotherapist and has lots of great information. She's a Myers-Briggs expert. So we will be diving into that because a lot of people are like, I don't get my kid. How do I connect with them? So we'll be talking about that. And as always, thank you for attending. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. And please, please share this information with other people. We'll be putting up the recording. You'll get access to that in your follow-up email. So share it far and wide so that we can get this information out to the parents that need it. Thank you so much. I appreciate you being here and have a fantastic night.